Okay, like that.
You guys, perfect.
And we are live.
Okay, hi, good morning. Welcome to our third week of the history of Christmas. I'm Courtney McKinney-Whitaker. I'll be joined by my husband, Pastor Stephen McKinney-Whitaker, in just a few minutes. And I'm going to wait just a couple minutes as we get some more folks trickling in and hopefully coming online as well. So, yeah, let's go ahead and we can go ahead and chat a little bit about what we started. If you want to, are you guys able to see comments from
Jack is,
Facebook or anything like that? So yeah, if you're out there in Wi-Fi land, feel free to join in the discussion. Jack can read your comments and we can join in. So this is our third week, as I said. So I'm just going to go ahead and click through. Today we're going to be talking about Christmas in the Protestant Reformation and the early modern era. So you might have seen in the e-news, I think it said it was the Victorians, and that's my and Stephen's fault. We revised the class and didn't give Sue the new list. So next week we'll talk about the Victorians. So if you're interested in the Victorians, and you should be, because they pretty much gave us our entire modern world. I always say, blame the Victorians. If there's anything you don't like, 90% of the time you'll be right. So next week we'll be talking about the Victorians, but this week we are looking at Christmas in the Protestant Reformation in the early modern era. There we go. Okay, and every week I just like to start us off with this question, like, why are we even here? Why should we study the history of Christmas? And any new thoughts or answers that you've had since last week? Anything you've been thinking about as you've learned? The things that we've talked about.
Well, it's always interesting to try and understand why we do what we do. Mm-hmm. And they change. I mean, I've seen considerable change over the years. Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, the thought of having a pro football game on Sunday was absolutely just not in thought.
Oh, wow.
And today we accept it.
I didn't realize that.
Oh.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, big, major changes. They happen slowly, but they happen.
But as you can look back, and I think that's one of the valuable things in a class like this is that we, from our perspective, even say we live 100 years, our human lives are so short that we can't always see the big movements. But as we look back over time, we can see how things are affecting our lives, and on down the line. Any other thoughts?
Well,
Yeah.
just in the generational changes, I remember my dad saying that they never had a Christmas tree until his oldest sister went off to college and came back and said, we need a Christmas tree. People have a Christmas tree in their home at Christmas time. And I don't think there was a lot of gift giving either initially. It was, they had to go to church,
Yeah.
maybe celebrate with a gift or two. But obviously it has morphed into something.
And that you said that was your dad's sister who went off to college?
His sister went off to college
Okay.
and came back and said, and she introduced to their family
Oh,
the
interesting.
concept of Christmas trees.
So what year was that?
What year was that? Probably in the
2011.
the mid-1930s.
Okay, interesting.
There we go.
I found an interesting dairy historical note. Okay, sorry. A dairy historical note from a couple of years ago, and I forget, Bobby may remember, but it was a note on those Thursday ones about how we didn't really have Christmas Eve services here until really like 20th century, like somewhat early 20th century, and they kind of started something simple, and then stopped, and they kind of started back up again. But Christmas Eve wasn't a big thing until later on in Dairy's history. Bobby, do you remember that?
Yeah, briefly, because when
not the 3 services, that came later.
And they didn't have a single one until kind of somewhat early.
Well, now, midnight mass in the Catholic tradition, why do they celebrate midnight mass?
They like it. No other important reason. I think just you celebrate it and you can go out. It's first thing. It's Christmas morning now, so it's more authentic to say, "Sing Jesus Christ is born this day" and all of that. And they use the Saturday night mass, so there's not any real big theological reason except for you come out. It's Christmas
But
Day.
it is like it's a holy day of obligation, and you have to be in church that day. Like my first roommate in college was Catholic, and she would always have to go, like on certain days, she would have to go to the Catholic Center on campus. And so Christmas Day is a holy day of obligation. You have to be there. So if you don't want to get up and go Christmas morning, you have been there in that 24-hour period. You know, if you do midnight mass. The night
Even
before.
like Saturday nights, they count that as people go Saturday night church. Oh, interesting note. Just I was talking to the Pearls who watched this class online last week, and they said a couple years ago they were in Bari, Italy, and they went to the church with St. Nicholas, and they said they conveniently left out the part about stealing the relic.
Stealing from my hands.
They left that part out.
He's always been here, right? That makes sense. I figured this thing out.
Okay.
So we're good. Okay, so just a little review from what we've been talking about. Week 1, we discussed those seasonal roots, the pre-Christian midwinter celebrations. And last week, we talked about Christmas in the early church and the medieval era. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, contributions from that? There are a lot of graves of St. Nicholas.
We were in Turkey, and Mary's grave was in Turkey,
Oh, wow.
where we were.
There's 3 of them in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
We went. I swear we went to. Yeah, and I'm thinking, am I dreaming this? But I swear we went there, and they have it's a big deal. And so why is that? And 3 in Jerusalem. Yeah,
And
what's
this
going
is
on?
Each branch of the church wants to have one, so people go to theirs. So Turkey, that's where kind of the Gospel of John, there's a
Right.
big center of
Same
that.
Paul.
So, and the idea that, well, Jesus says in the Gospel of John to the disciple we love, "This is now your mother." So the idea was she would have gone with him, and he went to Turkey, so she would have died in Turkey. So that's how they claim it there. But then there are 3 other tombs in Jerusalem, and each little branch of Christianity has this is where Mary's buried. Come visit it. Because everybody wants that connection.
And I don't know, like, because I can't even do it for myself, but, so I don't know, like, how to best get across the idea that, especially for medieval folks, this was not a problem. This was not like a logistical thing, you know, you can have 3 heads of John the Baptist, you know, why not? It could be. You know, and very much they were a people for whom things were possible, like anything was possible. So next week we're going to talk a little bit about how that idea gets dashed to pieces, you know, with the Enlightenment and our very like materialistic scientific understanding of how this has to be. Particularly with some of the issues surrounding conception, and as we learned more about human conception and how that works over time, it really shifted and blew people's minds, because if conception itself is a complete mystery, then, you know, it's a mystery. The more you understand about it, the more questions people are going to have, like, well, how exactly did that work, and like, how is God fully human, fully divine? Because if we have this scientific process, then where does that leave this? Bill, did you have a comment?
Hey, you mentioned about the multiple Mary funeral places. I can see how that happened, because that communication was nowhere near what we have now.
Truly, yeah.
So this little community, odds of them having connection with somebody 1,000 miles away is very remote. So they can have their own little
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
service,
that's certainly
their own little,
probably part of it.
whatever you wanna call it, memorial,
Mhm.
then the other people probably wouldn't even know about it.
Yeah, definitely a
And that
possibility.
would work for that community, and I could see where that would happen.
Mhm.
Today, something happens the other part of the world, and it's on your phone in seconds.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're almost connected, but we don't communicate, we're just connected.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for bringing that up. Oh, wrong way. Sorry. Okay. All right. So we're talking about just reminding you of our 3-layer cake, the seasonal celebration that we talked about the first week, that religious overlay that we got last week. Today we're going to kind of skip off of this because Christmas hits a huge roadblock. But I wanted us to keep it in mind anyway. Okay. So remember we talked last week about Christmas being like a snowball and how it kind of rolls through and picks up and drops different elements from different places and times. And this is what happens this week. Our little Frosty is going to melt. And why did that happen? Let's see, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen for just a minute to talk about what was the Protestant Reformation. So I'll switch places with you.
I'll explain the Reformation in 2 minutes. So a lot of you probably know a lot of this stuff. You know, we kind of give Martin Luther a lot of credit. He gets a lot of credit. But there are things bubbling up. People kind of seeing some of the abuses in the Catholic Church of the hierarchy of the power, but not just that, just the theology. Typically, major transitions in the church happen because somebody reads Paul's book to the Romans, letter to the Romans, and that really gets them thinking, like, well, wait a minute here, it says this, why are we doing this? Luther read Romans, he's questioning a lot of things about authority of Scripture, where tradition plays a role, grace, and all these things. So he writes his 95 Theses saying, hey, here's some things I think we need to do wrong. He wasn't really trying to start a new church. He was trying to kind of fix and amend the Catholic Church. But that doesn't happen. He's like, I can't just give up on this, so I'm going to keep going my way. Others kind of pick up his ideas like, well, yeah, we think some of these same things, but we think you're wrong on this area, so we're going to branch off into ours. So you have Calvin and Zwingli and all of that. So Calvin comes what we call the Reformed tradition. So the Reformed tradition is loosely a tradition that says Scripture is the only main authority. So in the Presbyterian Church, Scripture is the authority. We have a book of confessions, but it is there to help us understand Scripture. In the Catholic Church, you have Scripture and you have kind of tradition, all these papal bulls, creeds, official edicts. They are also pretty much on the level of Scripture. For a Reformed church, no, it's Scripture. Everything else comes way under. And so you have all these kind of churches splitting off, these new ideas, these new thinkings. And as part of this, should I go into iconoclasm?
Hang on just a minute.
Okay.
Okay.
I
Switch
wasn't
back
sure.
with me.
Switch back.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry. So in 1517, Martin Luther, we had this image of Luther like striding through the town and being like, I am a rebel, and nailing his 95 Theses to the church door. And that probably didn't happen, and it definitely didn't happen in the way that we imagine it. Okay, so the church door is a bulletin board, basically. So it's not like it was this big, like, rebellious action, and Luther himself probably was not actually trying to start the Protestant Reformation. That was not his, most of the time when things get started, people don't mean to start them. They don't realize that's what they're doing. They light a fire sometimes that they can't control. So not so much probably the big rebellious action that we sort of, 500 years of thinking about it have made it out to be. So this is in Wittenberg, Saxony-Anhalt. And the reason I put Saxony-Anhalt here instead of Germany is it's important to remember that these are German states. They're like little places. They're not Germany, the way we think of Germany today. Germany doesn't get unified until the 19th century. and neither does anybody actually. So that was 1517. That's kind of our big starting point with Luther. Okay, so the followers of Luther, who were later called Lutherans, and still with us today, they were okay with keeping that midwinter party element of Christmas. They were down with that. But they wanted to do away with anything that reminded them of being Catholic. So that was
Catholic Watch.
what?
Catholic Watch.
Yeah, that included the veneration of saints. So any kind of saint business, they were not cool with that. So, bad news for our friend St. Nicholas, right? So then we have this guy, who I'm sure you probably recognize. This is Henry VIII, he of the 6 wives. Another figure who probably has become blown out of proportion and really made up in our minds to indicate a lot of things that maybe he didn't actually do. So, but 1534, he needs a male heir. His Catholic wife, Catherine of Aragon, is approaching menopause, and she's not already in it. He's like, oops, I need a male heir. This isn't gonna work. So, and we've all heard the Anne Boleyn thing, yada. Anyway, the English Act of Supremacy, it makes the monarch instead of the Pope the head of the church. But that's essentially all it really does. It creates the Church of England, but the C of E remains pretty Catholic in its beliefs and its structure. But it opens this really important question, because all this stuff is happening on the continent. We're a generation almost after Luther. How Catholic/Protestant should the C of E be? And I think that's kind of a question that still
They're classic Catholics.
goes on today, So that's 1534. Then I'm going to turn it over here to you. Let me see where I go with that. Oh, okay. A little bit here, Stephen, and you can talk about our friend John Calvin, because he is important to us as Presbyterians.
So Calvin wrote the Institutes of Religion. Now, interestingly enough, I always say, in the Presbyterian Church USA, we talk about Calvin a lot, but we actually don't have a single document of Calvin's in any of our Constitution or any bit authoritative documents. So he wrote some confessions, but none of them were really all that great. So none of them make it into our book of confessions. Some of his students, like Hyman Bullinger, gets a confession in the Second Helvetic Confession, but nothing that Calvin wrote is really in our official doctrine or Constitution. But a lot of it's based on his Institutes of Christian Religion. I don't know how to summarize that, but he shares his thoughts on sacraments, on what makes a true church, how the church should be organized, and some of those basic theological claims. Now, a lot of these reformers, we want to kind of venerate them, but they weren't always great folks either. I mean, did Calvin advocate people be burned alive? Yes. Were they burned alive? Yes. They had strong ideas, like we do today. Hopefully we don't burn as many people alive today. But people get really involved in what they believe in. For a lot of parts of the Reformation, it really starts to become, even though it wasn't intended to be this way, it's my way or the highway. This is the right way, all that's the wrong way. And as you know, there are lots of wars about all of this stuff. And often there's more to it than just the religious side of it. There's usually a whole lot of money and power. I want to do what I want. Which is often why churches form new denominations or leave. They say it's about beliefs, but often it's, I want to do what I want. Like Henry VIII, Church of England, I want to do what I want. Oh, I happen to have a new church. People leave the Presbyterian Church to go to denominations where they have more freedom to do what they want, and then they start saying, well, it's about theology, or it's about purity of the church. No, it often comes down to, we want to do what we want to do. But one of Calvin's things in the process, you want to flip, or do I say? You and I. So one of the things that Calvin and some of these reformers did was this idea of iconoclasm, which was any images of God were bad. Kind of linking back to the Ten Commandments, you know, don't make false idols, all this. So a lot of the reformers, especially like Lutherans and Calvinists, smashed a lot of any kind of veneration of saints or sacred images, icons. So a lot of beautiful windows were destroyed, churches were destroyed, old painted wooden icons, all of those were bad because you shouldn't make an image of God, all of that stuff. So they tear up a lot of that. Then it kind of goes away and they like their pretty windows again. But it does come back again with our friends, the Puritans.
Okay, yeah.
Segue.
So the Puritans, as you see here, were English Calvinists who pushed the Church of England towards greater reform. And they're called Puritans because they want to, as they see it, purify the church. This is something we still see today, where people are like, you know what? At one time there was a true church, and it was the best church. It was the greatest church. We're going to go back to that church. And it's all made up, you know, because, and a lot of things, it's, you know, kind of invented tradition, or at least I say it's all made up. Was there ever a pure church, Stephen?
No.
You want to talk about how there was never a pure church?
Never a pure church. As Bill said, communication was different. So everybody who started trying to figure out, okay, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, we want to follow him. Everybody's trying to figure it out their own way. It's not until later in the Bible you get these Catholic epistles, James, Jude, that kind of helps give people some direction, but everyone's doing it differently. So you got some people today saying the early church had no music, so there can't be music in church. Then others point to, well, it says in the Bible, sing songs to God, make a joyful noise on the harp. What about that? Some people say a true church, everybody sells everything they own, gives to the church, and they use that to spread out, because that's what it says in the book of Acts. They're right, it does say that, but is that the only way of being church? That was in one instance. So basically, if you ever hear anybody saying they want to purify the church, or we're a true church, or go back to the original, they are selling you something, and it's all about them. Most Christian books, if you go to a Christian bookstore, most of those books are about them trying to make some money and convince you of something. I hate to say it, but that's often how it is. The history of religion is often about people using belief to twist and manipulate people. So I did a study of religion in the South in college, and so I infiltrated one of these cultist type churches where no music's allowed. You have to give them your tax returns on, do they know how much money should be given to the church and all this. And they were very much, we are going back to the biblical model of the church. But as always, we'll conveniently leave this out. We'll highlight this. Kind of like the church in Bari, we have this saying. We're not going to mention how we got it, but we got it. So yeah, there's no one true model that the church has ever been. The biblical model is different. They're different, because both of different areas that have communication. Everyone's doing it their own way. Even the early Catholic Church, it's like the Declaration, the Constitution. We tend to sometimes want to think, oh, the founding fathers were all of the same mind and had this equal vision of creating this nation. Nope, they all hated each other. They weren't all great friends. They had different ideas, and eventually it comes together. Same thing with the early church. Eventually it came together, and then eventually it split apart again. And testing, we have like over 100,000 denominations in this country.
Are you serious?
I think it's actually more than that. I gave a number about 2 years ago in a sermon. I have to go back and look it up. And that was from an old thing. There's hundreds of thousands of denominations all over the world because we constantly split. Because everybody has, well, we want to do it this way. We believe this. We want to have control over ourselves. We don't want a central authority. We want every different thing. We only want music written before 1980. So we're going to create the church of before 1980. It's like we want to go back to traditional church. There's no such thing. It's like even here we say we want to go back to the past. Well, which past? When there wasn't a Christmas Eve service? Because that's historical dairy. Or is it this little window of time that each person thinks is traditional, but that window changes for everybody? It's like in our book that Gilly wants us to read about what is Christmas, the Charlie Brown version. It's like Christmas is all these things. And one of them is Christmas is realizing there's no such thing as an old-fashioned Christmas. No such thing as traditional church. or true church or historical church. It's all different, and we all construct it differently based on the pieces we get. If I gave everybody here a box of 50 Legos and said build a house, every house would look differently. You get all the same blocks, but they're going to be put in a different order, you're going to design it differently, and that's basically the church. We have the same blocks of the Bible, but everybody's built their house differently. I like that analogy. Good for me.
Okay, so why did the Puritans oppose Christmas? And I want you to really think about this and take this in, because this is what I hear often from many people who are like, oh, Christmas is too commercialized, Christmas is too whatever it is. And I'll say, like, you would get along with the Puritans, like, and because I think we have in our minds, like, oh, Puritans bad, you know, but often, like, I'm like, this is what you want, isn't it, right? So why did the Puritans oppose Christmas? Number one, it was not biblical. You know, they're on solid ground there. There is no Christmas in the Bible because it didn't show up until several hundred years later. Not practiced in the early church, as we talked about last week. It didn't show up until several hundred years later. Full of pagan superstitions, quote unquote, pagan superstitions. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, they are on perfectly solid ground here. Number 4, too Catholic. You know, they thought kind of everything was too Catholic, so they were like, let's just separate. And number 5, I hear this one all the time, not spiritual enough. Christmas is not spiritual enough. Let's just, all this stuff, let's just get rid of it. But also, here's a big one. Holidays, do not happen in isolation. I was reading recently that up until within the last few decades, holidays were often put off into like sociology and not wrapped up in historical study and seen in context of what else is going on at the time. I think lately we've had more interdisciplinary work being done, and that's been a good thing because, of course, everything's always happening in context. Okay, this is the big one. Things had gotten out of control. Think of the tension management aspect of holidays that we talked about in week 1, where holidays let us let go a little bit, let our hair down, that kind of thing. Christmas had become sort of like the purge, like kind of like a time for everybody to get all of their pent up emotions, behaviors, whatever, out. It had gotten dangerous. Think of a lot of things that did happen at Christmas have kind of shifted back to like Halloween. So think of, on Halloween, we have this inversion where children can go to adults and demand that they give them treats, trick or treat, or they'll do something to you. Like, they were not joking about the tricks. Like, like
we will burn your house.
Like, we will burn your house, or whatever. Your sort of middle class, upper middle class, wealthier folks feeling threatened here a bit. Think of the "We Wish You a Merry Christmas" song. I'm not sure what the date is on that, so I wouldn't say that it would necessarily be directly from this, but the idea, bring us some figgy pudding, and the next verse is "We won't go until we get some."
It's not our nice holidays either.
It's not like, we will be here. Give us your stuff and your food and your, and it is that inversion of the powerful and the powerless, but becoming sort of threatening.
That part is biblical.
Well, yeah, it is, but it.
First Christmas hymn, all about that.
Yeah, but people don't like that.
No.
So, so here we go. Oh. Why is it doing that? Here we go. Okay, so this is Hosea King, 1678. It's a pamphlet called The Examination and Trial of Old Father Christmas. Stephen's a good reader. I really didn't read that. Your dramatic reading.
Father Christmas of the town of superstition, in the county of idolatry, has abused the people of this commonwealth, drawing and enticing them to drunkenness, gluttony, and unlawful gaming, wantonness, uncleanness, lavishness. Lasciviousness. Lasciviousness.
Let's hear that.
Cursing, swearing, abuse of the creatures, some to one vice, some to another, all to idleness.
Oh my.
Yeah, and the Puritans hate idleness.
They hate
I
idleness.
mean, they really hate idleness.
Wow.
I do.
And the Puritans are you know, I mean, I could go on all day about what the Puritans did to the mentality of this country early on. But that's sort of your idea of why we're trying to get rid of Christmas. How dare you people be enjoying yourselves? Well, yeah. Okay, so this is Oliver Cromwell. We talked about him a little bit last week. The Puritan Revolution in England, roughly 1642 to 1659, that's going to be our peak era of the suppression of Christmas, because we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but it never really goes away, you know, because you've still got people who really like it, and they don't want to get rid of it, you know. But the Puritans, this is the height of their power. And mine is pointed in the wrong place. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what's going on? The English Civil Wars. In 1642, roughly 1642 to 1651. I say roughly because there's always, you know, different little skirmishes here and there. So this is a series. It's not really one war. There are multiple wars going on at one time, of religious and political conflicts between the House of Stuart. So that's Charles I and Charles II, and opposing groups in each kingdom. So you have your parliament, because these, again, we do not have, the United Kingdom is not a thing at this time. These are separate countries that are all under the control of the House of Stuart. So the parliamentarians, they're called the parliamentarians in England, the Covenanters in Scotland, keep them in mind. We'll talk about them more when we talk about history of Derry and everything coming up in our 300th anniversary. And then the Confederates in Ireland. And they're all, for one reason or another, opposing the House of Stuart. Okay, so the parliamentarians take control. 1642, they outlaw any sort of seasonal plays. 1644, they move Christmas from a feast day to a day of penance. In 1652, no observance shall be had of the 5 and 20th of December, commonly called Christmas Day, nor any solemnity used or exercised in churches upon that day in respect thereof. So, boo Christmas. Okay, so there's this big Christmas culture war. Like, I mean, I have to laugh at our little dinky war on Christmas that we supposedly have today, because it is nothing. It is nothing compared to, what was going on. Because even among some of the Puritan sympathizers, even among some Puritans themselves, there was resistance. They liked it. It was traditional. It had been around for, as we know, thousands of years. It was fun for some. So there was always resistance, and you get street riots over this. You get, drunken mobs, public disapproval in the form of, sometimes public shaming, like your stocks and that kind of thing, and fines. As we often say, there's the law and there's what is done. And often those are two separate things. There's whether that law is enforced. Just because something's the law doesn't mean that's what's happening. So except for during the Puritan Revolution, it reminds me of like Facebook fights today. Like, how people get on there and they're like, but I don't like the elf on the shelf. And they're like, well, I don't like Santa Claus. Well, I don't think that the Christians should be shoving their stuff in everybody's face all the time. And yada, yada, yada. And everybody has to post something. So much ink has been spilled on exactly how you should celebrate Christmas. And we see it every year. But it's mostly kind of limited. It's mostly kind of petty, except during that Puritan Revolution, again, which is the peak era. Okay, so this is our political context that I just want us to have a little bit here as we're thinking about what's going on in the world. So this is Charles I. In 1649, the parliamentarians tried him for treason, and this is always how you get rid of somebody political, you just say that they're traitors. And they behead him for a variety of reasons, but mainly because they wanted to be in charge. I mean, that's always the reason behind it. So in 1653 to 1658, you have what's called the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. So there's no monarch on the throne. Cromwell is in charge. It's a quote unquote Republican government, which means there's no monarch. Cromwell dies in 1658, and we have one of those, or 1659, I'm not sure. But anyway, we have one of those situations where nobody's able to take on that mantle that he had. Like he was holding it to this protectorate together by the force of his personality, essentially. He dies. Things kind of fall into chaos. His son is unable to keep things together. None of his other folks are able to handle it. 1660, Charles II, who is the son of Charles I, is restored. It's called the Restoration. And his era is called the Restoration. If you ever hear about the Restoration monarchy, that's when Charles II was restored to the throne. So interestingly enough, the guy who helps restore him to the throne is actually one of Cromwell's top lieutenants. And what's going on is that things are descending into chaos. People are tired of it. They've had, at this point, roughly 2 decades of war, and they're sick of it, and they want whoever is going to provide them with some stability. Charles II has been in exile on the continent, hanging out, doing his thing. His thing is mainly like drumming up support for himself. He has powerful family members in other royal houses around Europe. And they basically get him back. He is known as the Merry Monarch. He liked to party. There's no doubt about that. So he kind of a complete opposite of what we think of with Cromwell. But essentially what happens is not necessarily because people think the monarchy is so great. They're just tired of constant civil war. And Charles II can provide some stability. So, good one. However, this is what happened. An entire generation of children had grown up without the delightsome Christmas memories on which adult devotion to the holiday seems to depend. England had lost much of the Christmas habit. So it's kind of like you have that break, the snowball melts, it kind of falls apart here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the American colonies a little bit now. Because, interestingly enough, we tend to think of everything as coming from Europe to America. And with Christmas, that's not necessarily how it happened. And we'll talk more about that next week. But famously, in 1621, William Bradford orders street revelers back to work. He says, we're not having Christmas, get back to work. Because a good half, so the Pilgrims were like even crazy according to Puritan standards. Like, so even folks in England were like, y'all are weird. Why don't you go across that big ocean? And because it's like too much. It's like just a little too much for them even. However, about half the people who came over on the Mayflower were not Puritans. They were they called them strangers, but they were not religiously motivated. They were motivated by it was an opportunity, possibly make some money. They had no other options. But not everybody who came over on the Mayflower was a Puritan. So there were some of them who were kind of wanting to keep keep Christmas alive, but not William Bradford, obviously. So 1659, this is the period when Christmas is actually sort of illegal. The Massachusetts General Court decides on a 5-shilling fine on anyone found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way. So you better not be resting or feasting on December 25th, or you'll get this 5-shilling fine, which then obviously wasn't super popular because it gets repealed, not too much later. So still thinking about the American colonies now, dissenters from the Church of England tended to object to Christmas. So these are the folks who were anti-Christmas. The Puritans in the American colonies, they eventually become known as the Congregationalists. Our very own Church of Scotland / Presbyterians who are Calvinists. John Knox is taught by Calvin, is that sort of right? Okay. Because he's an inheritor of Calvin. Methodist, Quakers, and Baptists. So they're not doing Christmas. At least not where anybody can see. So this is a quote from Samuel Davies. Anybody familiar with Samuel Davies? I think we have a window to him somewhere around here. So look and see if, I know we've got one to Francis McAmee. Yeah, I know that one, but I think we might have one to Samuel Davies. He's an early Presbyterian minister. He later becomes a president of what was then called the College of New Jersey, which is confusing because there's a College of New Jersey now, but it's two different things. So that College of New Jersey later became Princeton, which of course is what is the school that Presbyterians founded in order so that their ministers wouldn't have to go to Edinburgh to be trained. So I'm going to let our very own Presbyterian minister read our lovely quote from Samuel Davies.
Christmas is a time of sinning, sexuality, luxury, and various forms of extravagance, as though men were not celebrating the birth of the holy Jesus, but of Venus, or Bacchus, whose most sacred rites were mysteries of iniquity and debauchery. I do not set this day apart for public worship as though it had any peculiar sanctity, or we were under any obligations to keep it religiously.
So that's why we didn't have a Christmas Eve service until the 20th century, maybe, partly. So that was 1758. So definitely, Derry was around and probably not celebrating Christmas. But remember we talked about Luther a little bit earlier on, and it was really, and then I switched into talking about England. But these folks who were not heavily influenced by Calvin or Puritanism or Calvinism, they went ahead and brought those Christmas celebrations with them to North America. So we've got Lutherans, Catholics, the Dutch Reformed, Anglicans become known as Episcopalians, of course, and then some small German sects like the Mennonites. And they're fine with that. They're keeping their Christmas celebrations. So for a while, Christmas is being celebrated more in the American colonies and the early United States than in Great Britain, but in a very localized patchwork way. So please remember this from next week when we're going to talk about the revival of Christmas in the 1800s, because it is significant. So think about Ash Wednesday, something like Ash Wednesday. It's important to some people. Some groups of Christians observe it and go to church and yada yada whatever, but the entire culture does not stop for it. It's not anything like the force that Christmas is. So kind of like that. Some people are doing it, but it's not a big deal. The U.S. Congress met on Christmas Day from when it was formed in the 1780s until I believe the 1830s maybe. But anyway, it was a while. They were meeting on Christmas Day. School was open on Christmas Day. That kind of thing. So, okay, and now we're going to return to our St. Nicholas, our Snowball case study. And if anybody watching out there has young children who might not want to watch this part, you know, use your judgment about that. But notice what has changed about St. Nicholas from last week. I don't know if you remember the little image I had in last week, but we're going to talk about what's happening to him during all of this time.
It's very friendly.
Yeah, very friendly. What's he riding?
A white horse,
Mm-hmm.
Dominic the donkey.
a pure horse.
So yes, a pure white horse. White horses are, well, this probably comes from Odin. Odin is said to ride a white horse. But also, like, if you look back at, you know, the guys we just talked about, the Charleses and Cromwell and folks like that during those wars, it was interesting. I learned in Ireland this past summer that they probably didn't ride a white horse on the battlefield because that would be extremely dangerous, and everybody could see a white horse, and they would pick you off really quickly. But in legend, anyway, they'll say, like, oh, our guy was riding a white horse, you know, because I guess white horses are probably kind of rare. I don't know a lot about the genetics of horses, but a lot of it tends to be a rare color in the animal kingdom. Okay, so the Protestant Reformation was bad news for St. Nicholas, you know, as it was for all our saint friends. So a lot of the areas, most of Northern Europe that became Protestant, they wanted to keep Christmas but get rid of the saints. So get rid of any association with saints. Really anti-saint. Is that because of the priesthood of all believers?
A bit, and they didn't think you should, because it's not biblical, you shouldn't pray to anyone but God, don't pray to saints, priest of all believers, everybody's a saint kind of thing.
Yeah, we're all saints.
No icons.
Yeah. Okay. So Germany, the German states, again, not what we think of as Germany, but the general area, German-speaking area, they try to substitute. And instead of St. Nicholas bringing the gifts on the night of December 5th, they would have, I don't speak German, the Christkindl, or the Christ child bring the gifts on the night of December 24th. So the idea was they would get rid of St. Nicholas, make it more about Jesus, and turn the focus to Christmas and away from St. Nicholas Day. So this is where we see the gift giving to children migrate across December from St. Nicholas Day to Christmas. So they're like, this will be a great idea. We'll have the Christ child bring the gifts. Why not? Well, I'll tell you why not. It was weird. Nobody liked it. It was. They would have a little girl dress up in a white dress and walk through the town and pretend to be the Christ child, and everybody's like, that's weird. We don't really like that. And also it was boring. It was just boring. Like, people didn't get into it. People were like, eh. And I see that today. Sometimes I'm in a Facebook group for pastors' wives, and it's all sorts of pastors' wives from all sorts of like different traditions. And there's always like these big discussions about like Christmas and how people do Christmas and yada yada yada. And I just sit there, you know, with my popcorn, and I'm like, this is interesting. But sometimes people will say, like, well, why can't Jesus bring the gifts? Or, you know, and I don't know. I mean, maybe it worked for some people. Most people didn't like it. But it does give us Kris Kringle. Kris Kringle is an aberration of Christkindl. It gets, you know, people say it. That's where we get the name Kris Kringle. So, and maybe Kringlet too. I have Lutheran friends who are really into Kringlet. Is anybody really into? It's a cookie like type thing. In the Midwest, people loved their Kringlet. It's maybe it's the same. I don't know. I need to go back one. Okay. successfully shifted the gift giving from St. Nicholas Day to Christmas Eve. So that's how we got across the month there. So this is kind of funny. They really shot themselves in the foot here with this. Because they were like, we don't want to have saints. Get rid of the saints. And then people were like, but we don't want the baby Jesus bringing the gifts. Because, like, a baby's just not as exciting as, like,
Weird old
dude, I guess. I mean, I don't know. So what happens is, in attempting to get rid of St. Nicholas, people were just like, okay, let's just bring back the old gods, essentially, from, we talked about 2 weeks ago. And these are some of our nice substitutes for St. Nicholas. So we have Weihnachtsmann, or Christmas man, literally Christmas man, in
The creativeness, Germans.
in the German states, Grandfather Frost in Russia, Old Man Winter in Finland, Father Christmas in England. So this is also the era, of course, with the Puritans and their influence, where we get this whole idea of like naughty or nice, and the punitive aspect of St. Nicholas, whatever you want to call him, comes in. So these are our nice substitutes. They're going to be nice, and they're going to give you some nice stuff, and you're all good. However, we also have some naughty St. Nicholas substitutes, and these are our bad guys who go around, and they're going to like hardcore punish you if you have been naughty. Belfana is kind of a witch figure from Italy. In the German-speaking areas, we have Next Ruprecht and Berkta. Krampus is in the Austrian Alps. Krampus has enjoyed a huge resurgence lately.
People love Krampus.
People love Krampus. He's like this horned demon thing, and he goes around and he has a sack, and if you're a bad kid, he will stuff you in it and like carry you off to hell. That's the
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. I mean, so you better not pout. Good thing we don't do that to children anymore. But Krampus, there was a horror movie in like 2015 called Krampus. And lately I've seen like a lot of people having like Krampus parties and stuff. Where they all dress up and, So, but in the Netherlands, we have St. Nicholas turns into Sinterklaas. By the 1300s, well known, popular, they love him, it's all good. In 1516, Spain conquers the Netherlands. After they conquered much of Italy, including Bari, which of course is our center of St. Nicholas devotion by this point, and they drive out their own Arab rulers. We're getting close to the end, I know. Okay, so the St. Nick Snowball picks back up in the Netherlands. From Spain, they pull the idea that Sinterklaas lives there most of the year and he's tracking children's behavior from Spain. Then he arrives by ship from Spain on December 5th. He'll go around, he'll ask you, have you been naughty or nice? We get Zwartje or Black Peter. He's the guy who arrives with Sinterklaas, and he provides the comic relief, but he also punishes the naughty children. He's a really controversial figure today, and they don't do as much with him because it's kind of racist. People used to appear in modeling Black Peter in folks who dress up in blackface, and there are a number of theories about why Black Peter's. One is that it's that African influence in Spain. One is that it's soot from the chimney, because of course they're dealing with the chimney. One is that he's actually like a demon figure. Okay, then he's riding that white horse from German or Norse traditions. He's riding that white horse through the sky, as did Odin, to deliver the gifts on December 5th. But he's a nice Odin. He's not coming to like punish you. He's coming to give you some presents. And then from the Dutch, Sinterklaas is leaving gifts in children's clogs or wooden shoes. Okay, so he survived in the Netherlands and came with Dutch immigrants to New Amsterdam, later New York, where he just explodes. And we'll talk about that next week, how Sinterklaas became what we know today as Santa Claus. Okay, so I'm going to turn this part over to Stephen and let him kind of wrap up for us.
So we said earlier, the stories and legends tell us a lot about a culture. We learn what's important to a culture, what's not. So often it's less important to know whether a story is true according to our post-enlightenment mindset, and more important to understand what the story is trying to tell us about the people and their values. Same thing with the Bible. If we try to get into all these things about whether it actually happened this way, we're missing the point. They weren't always concerned about that. They were trying to tell an important story. So regarding all topics, it is instructive to ask, why was this traditional practice created? And perhaps more important, why did the public respond to it the way it did? After the same thing about the Bible, we should always ask, why was this story written? Why did it survive? And not get into, well, all the historical aspects. Why did it survive? What's it telling us? So what observations can we make based on today's lesson about what was important about Christmas, what wasn't, reflections, all of that?
I think it speaks to the survival of Christmas because people like the aspect of the party, the gathering, being together, and they didn't want to give that part up.
Yeah, sometimes we just need to celebrate.
I think it has something to do with the shortest day of the year, later, and the need to have some sort of a holiday, and it's convenient to connect it with the birth of Christ, so that it has both the opportunity to have a spiritual component, but also have a party where a social aspect.
Yeah. I think it gets into perspective sometimes when we're thinking about, like, oh, we want to celebrate Christmas the old way or whatever. Like, which old way? The old way where we don't celebrate it at all? I always hate the word traditional. It's like, what does that mean? You have to define our terms, because traditional celebration of Christmas in America could mean you get fined 5 shillings. That's traditional historical Christmas in America. But so are other things. So like, we often try to, problem with history, with anything really, is we try to claim it as our own. We take the pieces we want of the Bible, or of history, or of culture, and say, look, it's on our side, and we conveniently leave out the pieces that are not. But it's all a part of it. So all of this shapes the Christmas we have today. The things from the Netherlands, and Spain, and England, and the Puritans, and all of that. As Courtney said, there's so much you can get from the Puritans, just mindset that's still in us today for good and for bad. And even some of that kind of, we love to hate Christmas in a lot of ways. Like, no one's ever happy at Christmas, but they are happy. It's like you're happy, but you're also complaining about something. It's like we're complaining, well, it's this, it's too that. I didn't get this. It's not how